Hi, and welcome to the podcast for Reading for Narrative Part 2. These ideas that I'm going to be overviewing are from Jonathan Coller's book, Literary Theory, a very short introduction, and it is from the chapter called Narrative. Coller, like many others, including David Davidson, and of course some of the other cognitive theorists, suggests that stories are the main way we make sense of things, and that in this sense, that the whole world that we know and we understand is only functioning as we understand it because of the way we tell stories. Now, for Kohler and others, stories are told through a narrative structure, which involves notions of plot, different kinds of narration, and of course different narrative techniques, which we have explored briefly in the class. There are some key questions to consider when you're thinking about narrative. One, which we've covered, is who speaks. Is this first person, second person, or third person? And remember that first person narrations may also not only be the protagonist or lead character of the story, or first agent, according to the Greek translation of protagonist, but they also be participants or observers, depending on what role they play. For instance, most of you know The Great Gatsby. Well, Nick Carraway, the narrator of that story, is not the protagonist. He is an observer. Who speaks to whom? Readers infer from the text a narrator, a voice which speaks. The narrator addresses listeners who are sometimes implied or constructed, sometimes explicitly, especially in stories within stories, where one character becomes the narrator and tells the inner story to other characters. The narrator's story is often called the narratee, or the narrator's audience. That's a typo. Let me fix it. The narrator's audience is often called the narratee. We are being narrated. So the voice that we're hearing, this address that we're hearing, sometimes is kind of implied, like in Babylon Revisited, and sometimes we can see texts where they explicitly refer to the reader, and these are going to occur a little bit more rapidly in the kind of in our modern period, but even texts as far back in the Victorian period as Samuel Richardson's Pamela still refer to a sort of authorial intrusion. Reader beware. Stories within stories. If we think about that, we think about the story we just read, which was Babylon Revisited, and the sense that in that story we hear many different perspectives on the events occurring. So we have to think, the notion where one character becomes the narrator and tells the inner story to other characters, that we're hearing only one perspective of these other stories. Who speaks when? Narration may be situated at the time at which events occur. Telling may also immediately follow the events, and most common, narration occurs after the final events in the narrative. Like Heart of Darkness, when you have, of course, the narrator thinking back to a story that he was told by Marlowe, and telling it. This was kind of, a more removed, I guess you'd say, chronological situation. Who speaks what language? Remember, narrative voices may have their own distinct language. And we can see this like in Faulkner when he uses Benji's perceptions, who is a kind of a mentally handicapped individual who tells the narrative from that point of view, which does change the effects and how we see the events of the plot. Who speaks with what authority? To tell a story is to claim a certain authority, which listeners grant. We accept statements until we are given reason to think otherwise. Narrators are sometimes termed unreliable when they provide enough information about their situations and clues about their own biases to make us doubt their interpretations. Now, we've talked a little bit about unreliable narrators, and to a certain extent we can maybe make the argument that all narrators are unreliable. But we do want to maybe think about, for instance, in the Story of the Hour by Kate Chopin. The narrators, we grant a certain reliability to that voice, even though in many ways there might be some biases and some kind of information from the narrator that changes the way we look at Mrs. Mallard. Who sees? Discussions of narrative frequently speak of point of view from which a story is told. The question who speaks is separate from the question of who sees. From whose perspective are the events brought into focus and presented? the focalizer may or may not be the same as the narrator. And this we can really see in Babylon Revisited. We have a certain perspective of the events. These are presented by Charlie. But then when we have the interpretation of his wife's death and the custody of Honoria from his sister-in-law's perspective, it really does bring in the notion of who is really seeing. And this event is really captured and crystallized by this kind of tension. Variables that affect who sees often are related to temporal. This notion that the events are occurring afterwards or long afterwards, or they're being told as they happen. That there's distance and speed. Sometimes there's focused microscopically or telescopically, sometimes slowly with detail, or sometimes rapidly told. And of course, limitations of knowledge. A certain narrative point of view could give you everything, like a camera's eye, or it could be a fly on the wall and only capture one aspect of the whole picture. And this takes us back to that tension between objective and external versus subjective and internal. If you do have any questions or concerns based on this podcast, please feel free to to contact me. Thank you very much.